Hi, my name's Katie Lamke, and I'm a Bumble Bee Conservation Specialist for the Xerces Society, and I also coordinate the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas. Thanks in advance for watching our training webinars, and we'd like you to note that these were recorded live and included a question and answer session. We've edited the video for those of you watching right now to make it a little bit easier to follow. Whether this is your first time watching or you're using it as a refresher, we hope that it'll help you learn how to participate in the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas. If you have any questions that come up, feel free to reach out to us at bumblebees@xerces.org. Thanks. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, my name is Katie Lamke, and thanks for all of you guys for attending today. A couple of housekeeping things. We are not going to have the chat enabled today. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the questions and answer box, and we will have Rich and Doug sort of taking care of those. There is a raise your hand option. We're going to ask that you refrain from using that. Otherwise, I'm going to get a little notification every time somebody does that. And these sessions are going to be recorded. So if you have to leave a little bit early or you can't make the next one, they're going to be available online afterwards. So again, my name is Katie Lamke, and I am the project coordinator for the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas, and I'm a Bumble Bee Conservation Specialist for the Xerces Society. And with us today, we also have Rich Hatfield, who is a senior conservation biologist with Xerces Society, as well as Doug Golick, who's a professor of entomology at the University of Nebraska. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves real quick here. Rich, why don't you go first?
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Katie. I am a senior conservation biologist at Xerces and direct our bumblebee conservation programs. I will be behind the scenes for today, mostly just addressing some of the things and trying to make sure you guys have all the information that you need and links and things like that in the chat. So even though the chat shouldn't be active, I will be putting links in there for you to follow along with the program so that you can, if you want to address some of the resources or get to them when Katie mentions them during the webinar, I'll be providing some of those for you during the webinar. Again, thanks so much for being here, and Katie, thanks for hosting, and looking forward to this. Thanks.
Just want to thank everybody for being on today. I hope you enjoy the session today, and this is a cool and exciting project. That's a great partnership between the University of Nebraska, Xerces Society, the Nebraska Environmental Trust. So thanks for being here and supporting the project, and we hope to get you involved this year.
Okay, so with that, I think we'll get started. First, I just want to make sure that everybody knows that this is a two-part training. So Rich, if you want to launch that first poll, that would be great. So the first one today, we're just going to go over Bumble Bee ecology and conservation, and then I'm going to give you an introduction to the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas itself. And then the second day, which is going to be this coming Thursday, we're actually going to talk about the details and how you run a survey, how you net bumblebees. If 2020 would have turned out a little bit differently, we could have done that in the field, but Rich and I have tried our best to come up with some videos that will guide you through some of those things. And then we're also going to talk about how to identify different species that you can find in our state. So I'm looking at the first poll. It's like this is a lot of you guys' first introduction to the Atlas, which is good. And most of you are registered for the second session. Okay, so today we're going to start with just an introduction to pollinators and then talk about the value and ecology of bumblebees as pollinators, and then go into some of the threats and conservation actions that are currently happening to support bumblebees. And once we have that foundation laid, we're going to move into the actual Atlas project and why it's valuable for the state of Nebraska. So the Xerces Society is a nonprofit science-based organization that works to conserve invertebrates as well as the habitats that support them. And it was founded more than 40 years ago, and it's named after a butterfly that was the first one to go extinct from human causes. And so we have a lot of different conservation programs that work in agricultural biodiversity. Some of us work with aquatic invertebrates, some work with butterfly conservation, endangered species, pollinator programs, pesticides, anything that has to do with an invertebrate, we've got our hands in one way or another. And we're doing all of this work because it's been said that the fate of the world's insects is inseparable of our own. So there are estimates that say there's more than 200 million insects for every single human on the planet. And all of them have a pretty vital role in the way that our ecosystem functions. So they can be helping with decomposition, they can be a biocontrol agent. They serve as the base of the food chain for many species of fish or birds. And particular to today, they are valuable for providing pollination services. And the best thing about Xerces is that it is a donor-supported nonprofit. So it's because of people like you that become members and help support this work that allow us to keep doing it. So if you would like to become a member, you can go to xerces.org/donate, and there's going to be a couple different options there. So when we jump into pollinators, the last time that you might have talked about pollination was in 3rd grade or so for many of us. So when we think back to that time, pollination is when an animal, and that's usually an insect, visits a flower to collect nectar and pollen as its source of food. And then it flies over to another flower, and some of those pollen grains get deposited onto the female part of the flower. And this allows the plant to reproduce. And when the plant reproduces, that's when seeds come about. And so having a diversity of plants on the landscape makes for a really healthy ecosystem, right? Because the roots are helping with nutrient cycling in the soil, they're creating stable soil, they help with water filtration, and then the leaves themselves are helping to sequester carbon. But not only are they doing all of these physical things, they're also helping feed many of our species of wildlife, and that can be some of the songbirds, small mammals, all the way up to our larger mammals by feeding them with the seeds and the nuts and the fruits and the berries that these plants produce. And then the plants themselves are also helping provide a habitat for them to nest in. So not only do they help in our natural areas, but they also allow us to continue eating the beautiful diet that we've become accustomed to. So a few years back, Xerces had the opportunity to partner with Whole Foods and take everything out of the produce section that's pollinated by a bee. And it looked a little bit something like this. So we wouldn't completely starve, right? But we would certainly lose a lot of the color in our diet and a lot of the different nutritional items. So that's why we consider pollinators to be a keystone species. And a keystone species is an organism that has a disproportionately large role in its environment. So when you consider that 85% of flowering plants on Earth require cross-pollination, you can imagine that the world will look a little bit different if pollinators weren't there to carry out that service. And when we talk about insect pollinators, there's a few different groups that include butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. But the most efficient pollinator is the bee, and that's for a few different reasons. And one of those is that they're the only insect to consume nectar and pollen, both as larvae and adults. So that means they're constantly visiting flowers to collect floral resources as their food, right? So they need that pollen and that nectar. And to do so, they've adapted these physical characteristics on their hind legs that allow them to collect mass amounts of pollen. So if you look at this sunflower bee here, you can see that her hind leg has these really dense combs almost that allow her to just pack those legs full of pollen. And some of our other bees, like bumblebees, have adapted to have a corbicula, or what we call a pollen basket. It's basically a hollowed out groove on their hind leg that they just toss pollen into and sort of groom it back. And then it allows them to fly around from flower to flower and back to their nest in a very efficient manner. It's sort of like carrying all the groceries in on one trip. And what makes bees an efficient pollinator is that they also exhibit what's called flower constancy. So when a bee leaves her nest and she's going on a foraging bout and she's presented with a field that might have daisies and roses and mints, she's going to stay on the same type of flower throughout that whole foraging bout. So she's going to go from mint flower to mint flower to mint flower and then back to her nest. And she does this because it helps ensure that cross-pollination is being carried out, right? Because the mint flower needs the mint pollen. And so this system that the plants and the bees have worked out is very mutual and efficient for both of them. However, when most of us think of a bee, we're not thinking of wild bees, right? We're thinking of honeybees. And that's because they're an object of familiarity to us. Most of us have seen a honeybee in a hive because they're a nice educational unit. They're in the media a lot, especially in the past 10 years. But it's not what we're going to be focusing on today. So we're going to have another poll here. And how many different bees do you think there are in the United States, if you had to take a guess? See if we can launch that poll. There it is. How many different species of native wild bees are found in the US? Looks like it's a toss up there between 500 and 1,000, 2,000, 4,000. Okay, but the correct answer is 2,000 to 4,000. So there are actually 3,600 different species of wild bees in, let me clear this window here, in the United States. And so when we look at some of that diversity, slide that, oh, there we go. They come in all different colors and different sizes, and they have different nesting strategies. You can see here that some of them are bright green, some of them are very hairy, some of them have long tongues, some have short tongues. Most of our wild bees are solitary and they nest in the ground and they don't make honey. So some of our wild bees include the small carpenter bee. This is a beautiful metallic blue bee that you can actually find in Nebraska. And sweat bees, lots of people hear about these and you see them land on your skin. This is what one of them might look like up close. And all of those little pink dots on the hind legs are actually pollen grains that this bee has collected. And then we have bumblebees, super fuzzy, super cute, just flying around. And this species is one of the earliest emerging in Nebraska. And all of these different species of wild bees are actually the ones that are taking care of native plant pollination, right? These are the bees that are already in our natural ecosystems. We don't need to transport them in from another country. They're already here doing the services. So while honeybees are very important for our agricultural systems, we're really going to focus in on the wild bees today. So now we're going to move into the value and ecology of bumblebees. And when we focus in, bumblebees are quite a unique pollinator for a few different reasons. And one of them is their physiology. They're a relatively large group of bees. And this allows them to fly in colder and wetter conditions. They're also pretty intelligent, regardless of their small size. And I'll show a video of that later. And bumblebees have long tongues compared to some of our other bees. So this allows them to pollinate a wider variety of flowers. And having their large size, they're also a rather innovative species that allows them to use their strength to get what they want sometimes with flowers. So when we talk about physiology, bumblebees are capable of what's called muscular thermogenesis, meaning they can use their large flight muscles in their thorax, which is the middle part of the body where the wings attach. There's 4 large muscles in there that the bees can sort of vibrate really, really hard. And this allows them to generate a lot of heat. And relative to some of our other bees that might not be able to do this, it allows bumblebees to fly earlier and later in the day, as well as in cooler and wetter conditions that some of our bees wouldn't be able to tolerate. And they also have long tongues. So if you can see in all of these flowers here, the bees are having to reach their tongues way back into the spurs of some of these plants or the floral tubes to get to that reward. And this is a bumblebee here, this photo, carrying out what's called buzz pollination. And this is another way that the bumblebee can use its large muscles to pollinate a plant that a few other species are capable of, but most bees cannot do this. So what the bee is doing is it's inverting herself onto the male part of the plant. And this could be like a pepper or a tomato, a type of flower that sort of hangs pendant. And the pollen grains are held very, very tightly up in the stamen there. So the bumblebee has to vibrate her muscles so vigorously that it dislodges the pollen grains and they fall onto her body. And so about 8% of all flowers can benefit from buzz pollination. This could include some of our crops like tomatoes and peppers, but also some of the native plants like manzanitas or pitcher plants could use this. And so here's an actual GIF of a bumblebee carrying out buzz pollination. So you can see she's gripping onto the stamen there, and the powder that's coming out of that yellow tube are small little pollen grains that she's going to collect. And so now we're going to look at bumblebee intelligence. And so this is going to show how bumblebees can actually learn to access a reward. So here we're showing the bumblebee, hey, if you can push this yellow ball to the center of the platform, we will reward you with a delicious nectary substance. So the bee's going to go in there, find the sugar solution. And then after being trained, the bee is going to take the ball all by herself and move it into the center. And when she does this, she gets rewarded. And then the bumblebee actually teaches her friends and is like, hey, if we move this ball to the center, look what happens, we get a treat. And then the researchers took it one step further, and the bee essentially does calculus here to figure out the most efficient way to get her reward. So those balls are spaced differently, like different distances from the center. And she chooses the closest one to get that reward. So despite their size, bumblebees are quite intelligent species and have the ability to learn. And now when we move into ecology, we're going to have another poll here. So of the 3,600 species of bees in the United States, how many of those do you think are bumblebees? I'll get that poll launched in a second here. Maybe.
Katie, there's not a pre-made poll for that one. I'm sorry.
My bad. Well, the answer is 47. So all of you that guessed that, pat yourselves on the back. So when we look at diversity here, this is a map of the United States and Canada, and the red spots that you see are where there's going to be more species of bees on the landscape. So the highest regions are going to be out in the Pacific Northwest, as well as some of our more mountainous regions. And in Nebraska, we have about 20 different species or so. And if you're a bird person or a plant person, you know that when you are looking to identify different species, you usually have to get a guide to Eastern United States as well as a guide to the Western United States. So same thing for bees. We have guides for the Eastern and the Western United States. And when we look at the colony, most bumblebee species are social colonies. So they're made up of a single queen who founds the nest each spring. And there's female workers as well as male bees. And these bumblebees are on an annual life cycle, meaning they're only on the landscape for a single season. They're not going to persist through the winters like honeybees might do. And during the peak season in the summer, a colony, depending on the species and the availability of resources, the colony can peak at about 25 to more than 500 workers. And most of their nests are going to be found in these messy areas or wild areas that you might think of. It can be an abandoned rodent nest or in some bunch grasses, unmowed areas, rock piles, stick piles. Sometimes they're in bluebird boxes. And looking at the life cycle, it's kind of hard to pick a starting point since it is a cycle, but what we have here is a depiction of the cycle throughout all seasons. So on the left-hand side, it starts in spring, goes through summer, fall, and then winter. So if we draw our attention to spring, we have the queen emerging from the ground where she's been hibernating all winter long. And she's going to spend the next couple of weeks flying around looking for a nest location, again, somewhere that's a little bit messy seeming on the landscape. And once she finds somewhere to nest, she's going to collect some nectar and pollen and construct a couple of waxen pots. And then she's going to lay some eggs inside of these pots. And within a few weeks, those eggs are going to go into a larva, a pupa, and then emerge as adult bees. So during the summer, when there's more adult bees out, the queen doesn't have to leave the nest anymore. She can just stay in the nest and continue to lay eggs, whereas the workers are going to take over all of the foraging needs, protecting the colony, keeping the queen fed, tending to the brood. All the tasks that need to be done are going to be taken over by the worker bees. And then in late summer, you're going to start to see male bees produced as well as new queens. And the male bees don't really have a role in the colony. Their only purpose is to mate. So they're not going to be collecting pollen. They're not going to be tending to the brood. They're just there to meet the new queens as they emerge. So the new queens are going to mate with the males, and then the males are going to die off. And the new queen is going to go back into the colony where she's going to continue to be fed by the workers until they die off. And then the foundress queen is also going to die off. So then in fall, the only member of the colony that's going to be left on the landscape is that newly mated queen. And so she's going to forage around for any remaining blooming resources, store up on food for the winter, and then she's going to find somewhere to overwinter. And come spring, she's going to emerge and start that whole cycle over again. And the overwintering stage is something that science doesn't really know a whole lot about because it's hard to locate these bees, and picking up on the features that they're looking for on the landscape is pretty difficult. But last year, a new community science project was launched called Queen Quest that is trying to start keying in on what the bees are searching for when they're looking for overwintering habitat. And something else to be aware of with bumblebees is that there are cuckoo bumblebees. So those of you that are familiar with cuckoo birds, there are also cuckoo bees. So these cuckoo bees do not make their own nest. They do not collect nectar and pollen. They simply invade the nest of a regular bumblebee. And this has to be timed pretty precisely because they want to do it early enough that there's not enough workers to sort of defend the original queen from the cuckoo, but they want to do it late enough that there's enough workers to keep her fed and keep her brood fed. And these bees have a thicker exoskeleton. So the exoskeleton of a bee is sort of like the thickness of your fingernail. And these cuckoo bees are equipped with a thicker exoskeleton, probably as a defense mechanism. Okay, so now we're going to dive into the status and cover some of the threats to bumblebees. And many of us have heard that bees are in decline, but when we look at bumblebees specifically, it kind of started with a man named Robin Thorpe, who had the western bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee as regular occurring species in his study sites in California. And in the 1990s, he realized that a lot of them weren't there anymore. And so he sort of raised this red flag and was like, what's going on? And sure enough, the same thing was happening on the East Coast with the yellow-banded bumblebee as well as the rusty patch bumblebee. So Robin worked with the Xerces Society and some other researchers to form the Bumblebee Specialist Group, which is nested under the IUCN, or the International Union on Conservation of Nature. And this is a network of about 75 different bumblebee experts worldwide who teamed up to assess bumblebees and their status across the globe using consistent criteria. And Rich is actually the red list authority for this group and helped conduct many of these assessments. And what they found, if we look at just North America, is that 1/4 of all the bumblebee species are in a threatened or a near threatened category. So this pie chart here shows that there's 4 species that were critically endangered, 2 that are endangered, 5 that are vulnerable, and 1 that is near threatened. And then there's also 5 on there that just didn't have enough data to actually look at. And then when we take those species and look in just the central United States, 9 of those show up in central US. And if you look at the scale here, you can see that after critically endangered comes extinct in the wild and then extinct. And in Nebraska, we actually have 4 of these species that show up. So Bombus sucklei, Bombus variabilis, Bombus fraternus, and Bombus occidentalis. So these are all listed as species of greatest conservation need by Nebraska Game and Parks, right? Because we are aware that these are imperiled species and are in need of our help. And when we look at some of the factors that are causing these declines, it's really hard to pinpoint just one thing, right? Because it's actually a myriad of different effects that is causing these declines. It can be from habitat loss, pesticides, genetics, because bumblebees are very susceptible to inbreeding. And so we're taking some of our natural areas here and they get turned into cropland. And for a bumblebee colony to get to that reproductive stage where they're producing new queens, that can take about 16 to 21 weeks. And so when we're putting in these agricultural fields, these crops might bloom for a couple weeks, or something like alfalfa where it's harvested before the flower even blooms. We're essentially creating deserts for these bees because there's not enough forage for them. And same in our urban environments, right? We're taking these large open parks and sort of bulldozing them over to make more space for lawns or impervious surfaces, whether that be a parking lot or school or some type of system that isn't supporting any of our bumblebees or wildlife in general. And not only is it habitat loss, but there's also insecticide use, right? So one in particular is Imidacloprid. And these graphics here displayed the use in agricultural areas from 1994 up until 2012, where you can see it's pretty widely used, especially in the Great Plains. And imidacloprid is a systemic insecticide. So that means it's taken up in water through the roots and then expressed in the plant. So it can come out in the leaves, it can come out in the nectar, in the pollen. So when a bee goes to forage on this plant, they're essentially being exposed to a sublethal dosage of this highly toxic insecticide. But not only is it in agricultural areas, but we also see it in urban areas, right? So this is a parking lot in Oregon, and in early June, there were a bunch of linden trees blooming. Tons of pollinators all over them, but also many aphids. And if you know about aphids, they secrete this sugary substance called honeydew. And the honeydew is raining down on cars. And if you look at the parking lot floor there, you can see a bunch of black dots. And if we zoom in on all those little dots, each one of them is a bumblebee. And so that day it was estimated that about 50,000 bumblebees were poisoned. And so thinking about how and when we use insecticides, whether it be in an urban setting or an agricultural setting, is something that's very important for moving forward with pollinator conservation. Climate change is another factor. So bumblebees, sort of like us, they're adapted to this temperate climate. They don't like it too hot, they don't like it too cold. And a lot of researchers are expecting them to experience a range compression rather than an expansion, right? Because they're going to be losing some of that south part of their range, but not being able to adapt to a more northern climate. There might also be phenological mismatch going on where you might see flowers blooming before the bees have emerged, or vice versa, where the bees emerge in spring, but the flowers haven't yet bloomed. And then commercial bumblebees. So some time ago, we decided that we wanted to be eating tomatoes and peppers all through the winter and not just when they're actually in season. And so us being the innovative creatures we are, figured out a way to do that. And part of that process was rearing bumblebees in a lab setting and then shipping them around the globe. And this moved and amplified a lot of different pathogens that struck some of our native species pretty hard. Currently, bumblebees are only regulated in 2 states. And then managed pollinators. So beekeeping is not bee conservation. And so we're not here to preach that beekeeping is bad, because they are very interesting and fascinating species. They're a great educational tool. They're very important for our agricultural system. But becoming a beekeeper to conserve bees is sort of like getting chickens to help with grassland bird conservation. The two they aren't synonymous. So if you do decide to keep bees, or you already are keeping bees, just make sure you're doing it for the right reason. Okay, hopefully that was the saddest part of this whole presentation here. Now we're going to move into conservation efforts. And the important thing about conservation is to remember that it can happen across all different types of landscapes, right? There's no size limit that you need to sort of get conservation going. It can happen along roadsides, it can happen on small patches of parks, it can happen at your home, whether you have a yard or you just have a few potted plants on a deck. It can happen in an agricultural setting. There can be a whole webinar on bumblebee habitat, but here we're just going to focus in on 4 components that you want to include. And one of those is food resources, making sure you have nectar and pollen available from spring all the way through fall. You want to have shelter for them to include nesting sites as well as overwintering sites. And connectivity on the landscape is important so that you can help the bumblebees maintain that genetic diversity. And you want a place that's going to be relatively pesticide free. So when we look at food resources, it's important to have a diversity of floral structure on the landscape, meaning you want flowers that look different from each other, including their shape and their color, because these flowers are going to offer different resources. They're going to have different proteins, different amino acids that the bees are going to need to survive off of. And not only do you want differences in shape and color, but you want an overlap in bloom time. So you want early blooming resources and you want late blooming resources so that the bees are supported throughout their entire life cycle. And when we look at shelter, it's important to just have these messy or overgrown areas on the landscape. Many times bumblebees will nest in old rodent holes. They'll use stick piles, burn piles, brush piles, rock piles, bare ground. Pretty much anywhere that looks like humans would want to clean it up is going to be great habitat for a bumblebee nest. And connectivity, right? So just connecting small patches, whether it be parks, many times in cities, you'll see this happening along riparian areas. Whatever we can do to create additional habitat and just connect patches through our cities is really going to help bees and allow them to disperse pollen and keep those plant communities diverse as well. We also want to think about what constitutes damage. So a lot of us have fallen sucker at some point to wanting to treat and take care of everything. If we saw all of these little holes in our plant, we would get concerned instead of actually sitting there and figuring out what's causing this. And so if I were to see this on my plant, I would be ecstatic because I would know that that's from a leafcutter bee. So seeing all of these little holes, if we can start to see them as good things, right, rather than these imperfections and just learn to leave them, it's going to be a lot more beneficial for us. But if you do have to take the pesticide route, consider when you're putting it onto the ground and how you're putting it in the environment, because you can expose bees in many different ways, whether that's through direct contact, or maybe you're spraying the foliage that the bees are going to use for nesting. Maybe it's contaminating the soil that they're in. So just be aware of how you can be affecting pollinators if you have to use chemical application. And if you want some more details, Xerces actually had 2 really nice webinars come out in early May and late April. Maybe Rich can post a link for those later, but they go over the risk about pesticides and pollinators, as well as some of the threats and solutions. So there's just a couple more things here in conservation. One of those is leaving leaves. So in the fall, this is something that is going to help many of our beneficial insects, as well as potentially our overwintering queens. So like I said earlier, there's a lot of unknowns about overwintering queens, but when we leave a layer of leaves on the ground, it's essentially adding a layer of insulation for many of our insects to persist through the winter. And it doesn't have to look messy when you do it. You know, you can pile it onto a vegetable bed, you can put it around a flower garden, you can put it on the base of a tree, somewhere that just sort of leaves an area for insects to survive through the winter. And you can see that they're using a sign here, which is also a great idea, because some of your neighbors might hound you for leaving your leaves on the ground, but if you put that pollinator habitat sign down, you can be like, actually, this is what I'm doing. Same with some of our yards. I know there's a few people that like to have that tall grass prairie look and not mow. Signs can be really beneficial in just opening up your neighbors' perspectives on what it means to have pollinators in the area. So even though we just glossed over a lot of that there, Xerces has a great guide called Conserving Bumblebees, which was in the training packet. If you opened up that link you got in the email from this webinar, that goes over the threats in more detail and has management recommendations for creating high quality habitat. There are region-specific plant lists, as well as region-specific bumblebee ID guides. And Xerces also puts out a bunch of different publications that deal with all kinds of pollinator-related things, such as protecting pollinators at home. We have collecting and using your own wildflower seeds, Northern Plains pollinator plant lists. So if you're interested in learning more, you can go to xerces.org/publications. Rich probably dropped a link there for you. And now we're just going to take a quick break, maybe 10 minutes or so, and we'll see if there's any questions that haven't been answered, or if we have any specific ones.
Yeah, I'm going to feed a couple to you if that's okay, Katie. And there's several questions about the floral resources for nectar and pollen that bumblebees use. And one here, I think that encompasses quite a bit of this is, which I think you answered hopefully with that slide, is bumblebees obviously do collect more than one type of pollen. And you mentioned early and late and the types of floral resource they need. But I thought a question that was kind of intriguing here is one regarding when they collect one type of pollen or nectar, do they do that on the same trip? Do they hit multiple plants? And then how do they know when to switch, so to speak, to a different floral or resource?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I have seen bees that they'll come back with 2 different colored pollens on their legs. So they obviously switched at some point pretty, I don't know how to say it strictly, like the first half of their foraging trip was on one flower and the second half was to another flower, because you could see the clear color distinction between the pollens on their leg. But when they choose to switch might just be when they think the resource has been used to its capacity. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe Rich has insight on that.
You waved your hands just as well as I could have.
Yeah.
So here's another related question, since we don't exactly know all the answers. Are bumblebees specialists in terms of the food resources, and they generally able to utilize most sources of nectar and pollen?
So bumblebees in the bee world are what we call a generalist species. So we do have specialist bees out there who will focus on one particular plant family, right? They need that certain type of pollen to survive, but bumblebees will forage on a wide variety of plants and utilize many different species on the landscape.
Another question that I kind of like here is, I think they noticed it from the map that you put up, that there's fewer known species in the eastern half of the U.S. than when you get out west. Is that related to European settlement, or is it just an occurrence of nature?
I would guess that is because their bumblebees are more adapted to that Palearctic region. So in the west, we see there's a lot more elevation, and many of our species are high country species, so they're only going to be found in those higher elevation regions.
Yeah, maybe Rich has some insight, but yeah, I think that's correct, Katie. And you get, what is it, Nepal and China are some of those hotbeds with huge numbers of species in the mountain regions there.
Yeah, that's right. And they're just, in the Northwest, from the coast to 100 miles inland, you have just incredibly diverse types of habitats. You go from, coastal to coastal mountains to valley to alpine to desert in 100 miles. And it's just so many different types of habitats that have just led to an explosion of obviously different plant types and different pollinators associated with them. So that's why that, along with the fact that bumblebees are sort of cold weather specialists, lead to that diversification that we have in the West. But it's a natural thing, yeah.
Another question, two questions on this. They're related to conservation using the leaving your leaves in the fall, which I think is a great idea. That means I don't have to rake any leaves. One is the thickness of that layer of leaves that you need to leave. And then, yeah, we'll start with that one, I guess.
I mean, again, whatever you're comfortable with leaving on your yard. Probably not so much that it mats the entire ground, but enough that there's a pretty solid layer there.
Yeah, just to jump in, it's you don't necessarily want to do, if a green lawn is important to you, you wouldn't want to leave a thick layer on your lawn for sure. But you can certainly use several inches in a garden setting, and most of it will just compost by the spring, or by the end of that summer. So it's a really good mulch to use in the garden. But you could leave a thin layer, as Katie mentioned, in your yard, which will also fertilize, naturally fertilize your yard. But probably don't want to leave it a couple of inches of leaves underneath a few inches of snow could permanently damage your lawn. So you do want to be a little careful there.
Another question, when establishing native flora in roadside ditches, is there serious bee mortality from vehicular trauma?
I've heard Rich answer this one nicely before, and what I recall is that there is not a huge, like the number of bees that get hit by cars is not enough to damage the population. So over time, if we are establishing these roadside habitats that are going to feed and support them, the number that we lose shouldn't damage the populations.
And then coming back to biology, there was a question about specifying, does a nest produce only one new queen that was a reproductive queen each year, or multiple?
Multiple. Would you like to expand on that one, Doug?
Yeah, I guess. They produce multiple new queens, and what we would consider to be the reproductive males. And some species can produce even, I've heard, as much over 100 new queens. The mortality rate for that queen actually establishing a nest next year is very low, 1 or 2%. They are susceptible to disease, predation, desiccating, being dry in the winter, just like a lot of other creatures. So Some of those different species produce a ton, and others produce less as well, both the males and females. And I don't know if Katie, well, I probably didn't talk too much about it, but and sorry if you did, Katie. But you know, the different species in the state of Nebraska, for example, we have some that have 30 members at max at any one point in time, to some that have several hundred, and that sort of varies by the species and biology of that species. Let's see here. 2 questions about resources. Maybe Rich can chime in here. One person asked, is there, for Nebraska, where we're kind of divided by east and west, what resources are available for Nebraska as far as identifying those bumblebee species and what you might find there?
Yeah, so that's what we're gonna get into here in a couple minutes, but for the Atlas project, we have come up with a guide that has all the species in our area, as well as some that might be in the surrounding state. And if you tune into the session on Thursday, we're gonna dive into how to identify those species.
And there are a couple more questions. I don't know how much more time you have, Katie. They keep coming in.
Okay, let's do one more.
Okay, let me find a good one here. Since we're talking about biology, and we'll have more time to do some of the other conservation here in a bit, will bumblebees reuse older hatch nests from the previous year?
Oh, as in like those bombiciles that you put out? Have you seen them reusing your nest boxes?
I think, well, yeah, and I think they said hatch nest, so I'm assuming that's the, you know, reusing the cavity where they've already established a nest in the previous year. So what, there's I think there's 2 questions maybe there that I hadn't thought of, Katie. One is natural, and then if we put these boxes out again. So I'll start with the boxes. We have these artificial domiciles that people have tried for years that have moderate success depending upon where you are in design. That varies. We've had some go in the same spots, but it's way less frequent. And then naturally, Katie, typically not.
Yeah, I don't know if they don't. Yeah, because even with a lot of our solitary bees, they haven't been shown to reuse the nest. And if they do, it's to go like eat up the old poop to get some nice bacteria in their gut before starting the season, but it's not sure if they actually nest there or not.
Yeah, it's pretty counter to them because there's a lot of disease, you know, transfer. So if it's messy, those old nests, and they're cavity nesters, so they're using where a rodent has been. So not very typical. And there's a great study in Japan that someone did where they looked at reuse of sites, and read it a number of years ago, and there wasn't a statistically significant difference. So science would tell us no in that particular study. We do have other questions, but I think we'll go ahead and save those. And then there's some questions about particular projects and relationships we'll save to the end that Rich maybe can chime in on.
Yeah, we'll have about 10 minutes at the end or so for more questions too. Okay, so we're going to jump back in here and briefly go over what it's like to participate in the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas. And the Atlas, again, is just a statewide community science project that's aimed to track and conserve the native bumblebee species that we have here. So in 2019, Xerces and the University of Nebraska-Lincoln were supported by the Nebraska Environmental Trust to sort of get this project up and running. And we're choosing to focus on bumblebees for a couple of different reasons. And the first one is that they are very charismatic species. So when a lot of us think of bees, you'll think of a sting or a honeybee, or it have some sort of negative connotation. But when you hear bumblebee, sort of a different mindset, right? You think of that big, clumsy, fuzzy creature flying around in the landscape. And they're also a generalist bee. So we just answered in one of the questions that they're going to forage on many types of flowers. They're going to be found in a few different ecosystems, right? Where some of our wild bees might be specific to a wetland or a grassland. You're going to find bumblebees all over the state. and they're going to have a long active season, meaning they're going to be visible on the landscape from April all the way through September, October, sometimes November if we have a warm fall. And in Nebraska, there's actually a pretty rich historical data set as well. So here we have a map of Nebraska, and all the little gray dots are historical observations of bumblebees that were collected way back in the 1880s on horseback by a man named Wally LaBerge. And some of these species are actually preserved in the research museum that the University of Nebraska has. And so this species here that you see is a cuckoo bumblebee that was collected in August of 1892 in Lincoln. So that's a really rich resource for us to have that state museum around. And then all the blue dots you see on the map, most of those were actually collected by Doug during his graduate research. And so having this type of data is going to allow us to do some really nice historical comparisons to see what we're finding now versus what was back in the 1800s or even 50 years ago. And so to set the project up, we divided the state into 78 different grid cells. And so when somebody signs up to participate, you're essentially going to select a grid cell to adopt. And when you adopt a grid cell, you're saying, I want to survey this particular spot of Nebraska. So you're going to go out to your grid cell sometime between June and September, and you're going to do a bumblebee survey and a habitat survey. So once you've collected your data, then you're going to submit that data, and Rich and Doug and I will have this huge data set that's really going to improve our understanding of bumblebees across the entire state. And so the dark green cells that you're looking at here are high interest cells. And these were selected as high interest because they're either a very rich habitat in Nebraska, so it might be somewhere in the Sandhills, it might be up by Niobrara. Could also be a spot where there's a lot of historical data that would be nice to do a comparison on to see what we're finding on the landscape now. Or it could be an area that has absolutely no bumblebee data and we're just curious what's there. And the nice thing about this project is that it is community science. So with all of us teaming up together to spread out across Nebraska and look for bumblebees, it's going to be a lot more efficient than the three of us could do on our own, right? Because we're all going to be able to spread out and collect mass amounts of data and really update this baseline database that we have for Nebraska that's going to allow us to look at population changes, look at the distribution of species, and fill in knowledge gaps. So look at things like what are the bees picking up on habitat as a key feature, right? What do they need for nesting? Is there something about this site that's allowing the population to thrive? And having this type of information is going to allow us to form evidence-based recommendations. And these recommendations are really going to help agencies like Nebraska Game and Parks sort of refine their conservation measures to really make the most efficient choices for supporting our pollinators. So when it comes to participating, you start by adopting a grid cell. So you would log on to nebraskabumblebeeatlas.org and you zoom into this map and select wherever you want to survey. Maybe right now with the given situation, it's just in your backyard or somewhere close to home. We're certainly not asking people to travel out of the way because the community health is much more important than bumblebee surveys. So once you've adopted your grid cell, that's when you take a second to learn the protocol. And last year we had a lot of fun with this and we held workshops in Lincoln and Omaha to give people the same type of information that we just went over with Bumble Bee Ecology and behavior, but then we would spend half the day in the field learning how to net bees and put them in vials and photograph them. And so since we can't do that, Rich and I have created an online portal where there are some nice videos that are going to show you how to net bees and how to vial them and how to submit your data. But we are going to have a live presentation of those videos on Thursday, so you can tune in for that. But if you don't want to tune in, they are going to be available online. So once you are confident and you know what you're doing, or you at least think you know what you're doing, you can go out to your grid cell and you're going to select an area within your grid cell and you're going to run your survey. And this is a catch and release project. So the way that we get around that is by placing a bee in a plastic vial, and then you place that vial on ice. And this chills the bee and she essentially enters into a hibernation mode. And so you can take these really high quality photographs like the one you see in the top right here that allows Rich or Doug or myself to verify this bee down to the species. And then the bee will warm up and she's released unharmed. So once you've run your bumblebee survey, then we ask you to do a quick habitat survey to say what flowering resources are in the area, if there's any management practices going on, if you see any evidence of potential nesting habitat, and then you submit your data. And when you submit your data, it goes through a website called Bumble Bee Watch. And I'm curious to see how many of you have used Bumble Bee Watch. We have another poll for that here. So on this map here, what you're looking at is almost 60,000 observations of bumblebees that are just photos that were submitted by people like you and me. You see a bumblebee and you upload it and it goes into this huge database. It's essentially like iNaturalist, but specific to bumblebees in the United States and Canada. And so let me get that window off of here. The app is available for iPhones as well as Androids. And a lot of people, they get discouraged because they're like, oh, I can't identify a bumblebee. Well, you can just enter Bombus SP, and then somebody like myself or Rich or Doug can go in there and verify the species for you. So in just last year, oops, my screen's frozen over here. There we go. This is a map from 2018 and 2019 that are just lifted right off of Bumble Bee Watch. This information is accessible to anyone. You can go in and see photos that have been submitted, where they were taken. And you can see that in just the year that the Atlas was launched, we kind of filled in Nebraska there for observation. So community scientists were able to add 670 new observations of bumblebees just last year. And that was pretty exciting for us to see because we had sort of a late jump and didn't really get people involved in the project until August. So this season, surveys can begin in June and go all the way to September. So we're looking forward to a full sampling season this year. And here we have a map of all the historical data plus Doug's data. So anything before the Atlas is in red, and anything that was collected as part of the Atlas last year is in green. So again, you can see a lot of last year's data came from the Lincoln, Omaha area because that's where we held our workshops. But having this type of information is going to allow us to look at those population trends, right? How are today's populations different from 100 years ago or 50 years ago or even 20 years ago? And really see what areas of the state we need to be picking to do our conservation efforts in. And then we can also look at species distribution. So those species names there, it's just the names of different bumblebees. And you can start to see where they exist in the state and get an idea of what numbers they're in. So last year, of the species that we were able to verify, 10 different ones came out. And one of those was Bombus citrinus, or the lemon cuckoo bumblebee. And we only had 4 of those, but what was exciting is that it appeared on the very edge of its range. And so while this isn't a species of concern, of conservation concern yet, it's still nice to see that it appears on the edge of its range, because we know that when species are in decline, where you start to see them losing population or areas is at the edge of their range, right? So as they're declining, you're going to see them start to disappear from the edge. So the fact that we observed this bee on the very edge of its range is exciting news. Volunteers also observed 14 different individuals of Bombus fraternus, or the Southern Plains bumblebee. and that one is a species of conservation concern. So having that sort of information again for Nebraska Game and Parks and going into their natural legacy database is going to help the state refine those conservation measures. And these species, or I guess the individuals, were picked up statewide, again, which is good to see that it is still found throughout Nebraska. And then from the habitat data, we can start to glean information about some of their preferences, right? So these are the top 10 plants that bumblebees were shown, or I guess observed visiting during that 2019 season. And although most of the data only came from the Lincoln, Omaha area, it's still some nice insight. And we're hoping to expand into central and western Nebraska this coming season. So here we have a current map of the state, and all the gray grid cells that you're looking at are ones that have been adopted but are still available. So even if it's gray, you can still adopt it. Unless it's dark gray, that means too many people have adopted that one, so we've closed it off. But what we're really hoping to do is to get those green grid cells adopted, and especially those high priority ones, and see if we can get at least 2 habitat surveys from every grid cell. So it might be a little bit constricted with the coronavirus going around. So again, we only want you to participate if you feel safe doing so. We don't want you going out to do bumblebee surveys and putting your life at risk and somebody else's. So make sure you're following local and federal health regulations as you're planning your surveys. And looks like we have a lot of time for questions. If you do want to participate in the second session, again, we're going to show videos that Rich has prepared that kind of show you how to net bees, how to put them in vials, how to photograph bees, and we're going to look at bumblebee identification. So if you haven't registered for that one yet, there should be a link in the chat box. Otherwise, we will take any questions, and then I think we can end a little bit early.
Hey, Katie, a couple that came in about recording data here at the end. And I know, Rich, you put a poll up there. Is there a poll to do at the moment? Katie, do you want to do that first?
Yeah, it's just an ending poll.
Okay.
So they're going to be at the next session.
Okay. As they're doing that, a couple questions that came in were about observations that they've made previously, so old pictures, and then also if they put data into iNaturalist, how does that at all interface into the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas?
I'm going to let Rich answer the iNaturalist one because he is sort of the head of Bumble Bee Watch there. But if you have old photos, you can certainly still submit those and just change the date to when you submitted or when you observed the bee.
Yeah, agreed. If you know the date and the location that the photo was taken, you are welcome to submit them for as far back as you as you have photos. That'd be great. For the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas project, we will not grab data from iNaturalist. All data from the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas needs to be submitted through Bumble Bee Watch, either the app or the web app. That said, the data that goes into iNaturalist eventually feeds its way into the North American bumblebee database. So we do use it for our conservation planning and for the assessments that we do. But data from the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas, in order to be analyzed for this portion of the project and for us to gather these evidence-based recommendations for bumblebees in Nebraska, we need to have those data submitted into Bumble Bee Watch. That's the only place we'll be able to pull them. And part of the reason for that is that when iNaturalist is a tremendous platform and it's highly valued. But one of the problems with it is that the identifications there can be made by anybody, such that you can get what they call museum or research quality data when the species has only been verified by someone that doesn't know bumblebees all that well. And there are enough lookalike species in Nebraska and other places that we're looking for a little bit higher quality threshold to call something research grade. So we have experts verify all of our photos at Bumble Bee Watch, which is why we launched it, as opposed to iNaturalist, which is more of a crowdsourcing network. So that's why we're using Bumble Bee Watch instead of iNaturalist.
A question here about how long does it take to do a survey in a particular grid?
Yeah, so that'll definitely be covered next time, but in short, a survey is 45 person minutes. So if there's one person out surveying, you're going to be looking for bumblebees for 45 minutes. If there's 4 of you out there, it's going to be, 15 minutes or so. So it depends on how many people are actively looking for bumblebees, but you take 45 minutes and divide it by the number of surveyors. And then the habitat survey can be relatively quick. If you know your plants, it's easy to do the survey and write down what you see. If you don't know the plants, it might take you a little bit longer the first couple of times you do it as you're learning them. But that's where apps like iNaturalist can really come in handy, because you can get some idea of what plant you're looking at right away from the app, or you can use a field guide. But depending on your knowledge of plants, I think could slow you down, but otherwise the habitat survey shouldn't take more than 15 minutes.
There are 2 questions that are very similar here. I want to participate, but the grid I hope to collect in is completely filled. So can I participate or not? And the next one is very similar. If it's mostly adopted, can I still participate if it's not completely filled?
Yes, you can still participate if your grid is full. We're not asking people to travel outside of their comfort zones right now. And what was your second question?
Yeah, same thing. If it's completely adopted and they can't adopt, what do they do? Can they still participate?
Yeah. Yes, you can still participate. Some other reasons that people might travel would be that they have family members out west or in central Nebraska. Many of us aren't traveling for work this year, but that was a good excuse to get out last year. So pick somewhere that you're comfortable and are safe going to travel when you're adopting your grid cell. If it is completely full and you don't want to travel, you can 100% still participate.
Next question. Will I mess up the sampling if I go out more than 2 times to sample within an area?
Absolutely not. You can sample as many times as you want to. We would love it if you sampled more than twice. So we just ask that you sample a minimum of 2 times, but you're welcome to do as many surveys as you want to. I know there's some volunteers, maybe they're online right now, but they have already told me they're going out next week, first week of June. They are ready to start the surveys again.
Hopefully creating some bumblebee fanatics, right?
Yeah.
Coming back, here's another one that's in this line. Will you go into more detail on conducting surveys on Thursday?
Yes.
Okay. How about, are you interested in high quality photos that aren't netted or photographed? I'm not sure what that means, but.
Yeah, if you look through Bumble Bee Watch, you'll see that a lot of photos are just taken of the bee right on a plant. Those are totally welcome. We just need to see a few specific areas of the body to make an identification, and that's something that we're going to go over next time as well. So when you are photographing a bee, there's a few different parts of the body and hair patterns specifically that we need to see to really be sure about the species identification. So if the photo is not of a frozen bee, it can still work as long as it has those key parts in it. And if you don't want to wait for the next session and you want to know right now, you can go to the Nebraska Bumble Bee Atlas website, and there are tips on there for what we need in photographs.
Jumping back to a couple earlier questions, what are the major predators of bumblebees?
Anything that would want to eat a delicious little bumblebee colony and risk getting stung a few times. Maybe a casual lawnmower.
There's other insects that do. Skunks, I think they can get in there. Yeah, like I'm not quite like honeybees, but no, maybe Rich knows. I've seen the psyllids, which are robber flies that look just like the bumblebees and grabbing actual bumblebees.
Oh yeah, crab spiders.
Crab spiders. Yeah, I was going to say crab spiders. I think ants are fairly large predators as well. They go into nests and steal eggs and pollen and nectar as well.
Yeah, especially as they get weaker, right? Throughout
Yeah.
After they hit sort of post or peak population. Not too many things mess with the peak 200 or 300 member bumblebee nests that I'm aware of intentionally. There's one I left up here, and we can. And maybe you can talk about similar things here. But somebody's got some funding apparently to do about $6.5 million to do a study on the attractiveness of garden center plants to pollinators. Anybody know the specifics of that, and maybe just want to comment generally on cultivars?
I do not know anything about that.
Rich,
US pays 5 years.
I don't know anything about that specific project, but I can wave my hands and give an answer. So I don't know anything about that specific plant, but garden center plants in general, it's fair to just recognize that all plants are not created equal when it comes to feeding pollinators and other flower visitors. Especially a lot of cultivars you can find in garden centers have been bred for the way that they look rather than how functional they are for pollinators. So you'll find a lot of plants there that are virtually non-functional plants that have double petaled or triple petaled or quadruple petaled. A lot of pansies are like that. So you do have to be careful how you source plants from garden centers. The other major issue with garden centers is a lot of nurseries these days are pre-treating their plants with the neonicotinoids that Katie mentioned. So imidacloprid is one of the 4 highly toxic neonicotinoid chemicals that are available, and they're often pre-treated with these chemicals at the nursery so that when they get to the store shelves, they're not brown or curled and they look like they're ready for your garden. But in fact, they may have been pre-treated with these insecticides, which means that the insecticide itself is in the pollen and the nectar. So you really do not want to be planting plants like that in your garden. And before you source plants from a place like that, you want to be sure to ask the nursery owner or place if they have been pre-treated. And if they have not been, that's great. If they have been, then I would not purchase those plants. And if the nursery owner doesn't know the answer to that question, I would take my business somewhere else, to be frank. It's an important enough issue, and these highly toxic chemicals really don't have a place in an ornamental setting at this point. Agricultural settings, totally different issue, and we could have a separate conversation about that. But in ornamental settings, we need those plants to be feeding the invertebrates that we depend on. So they don't really have a place in them. So again, I don't think that specifically answers the question, but dances around it enough and probably gives a good enough answer.
Yeah.
Leslie, add this question as you're talking, Rich, and I can give an answer to this one. When they spray the nursery plants, don't they have to label them at the store? Not necessarily. And you go to the big box store, a lot of times they don't have listed. And I'll share something that goes along with what Rich said. I had a nursery person contact me because someone asked her this question, Rich, and she didn't know the answer about whether her plants was treated. She had to go to it was one of the 3 or 4 major importers or distributors of plants in the country, and had to go ask them because it wasn't really clear to her if they were treated with neonicotinoids. So we would like to hope they would, but I think Rich has it exactly right. If they can't tell you where it came from, then take your business elsewhere, or find a place that does.
The other thing I would add to that, Doug, is some of the larger box stores have agreed to label plants that are pre-treated with neonicotinoids, but they don't say that they're toxic to bees or dangerous to invertebrates. They're labeled as such. They say something like, we're protected against aphids and other plant pests.
Yep.
So the labeling is misleading, even if it is there. So just beware.
More bumblebees in native grass than other habitats is the question. Is there more bumblebees in native grass than in other habitats?
This one was kind of answered earlier when we were talking about more different species in some of our mountainous regions and in the Pacific Northwest, because there are so many different types of habitat out in the Pacific Northwest, right? You have the mountains and you have meadows and you have the deserts. So it's not necessarily that there's not more species in the grasslands, but we have about 20 or so species out here.
Yeah, it kind of depends on where you are too and what's around it, you know.
Yeah, because even in the state here, there's going to be species that occur in Nebraska, but you're only going to find them west of North Platte.
Kind of two related questions. One person said, I want to submit photos, but I don't want to grow up, maybe adopt a grid cell. I may just kind of do it as I do my other iNatural stuff. Is there a way for them to submit data that way?
Yeah, you would just have to submit your photos through Bumble Bee Watch.
And then
just to follow up on that, though, there was another question about sort of incidental sightings about, can I just take pictures from my backyard and submit them? Yes, you don't have to do an official survey to contribute to the project. One of the questions we're interested in is how distributed are different species in the state of Nebraska, and any incidental observation will give us information about where species are living, what plants they're using potentially, and what time of year that they're found. But generally, recommendations for your backyard wouldn't be to submit like 500 photos of the same bee on the same flower. We're looking for in the same location, what species of bees are using what species of flowers. So to the best of your ability, submit sort of one species of bee per species of flower that it uses as a resource. That's a general guide. But yeah, please, more observations of bumblebees are great. They help us to learn a tremendous amount about their distribution as well as their habitat use and their phenology. So incidental observations are great for different reasons. And Katie will go over the benefits of incidental surveys versus complete surveys on Thursday. There'll be a lot more detail about that. So please, if you're interested in some of these bigger questions about surveys, come back on Thursday, or if you can't make it on Thursday, we're going to record it again and you'll be able to see it by the weekend. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and there is a question on here if these PowerPoints are going to be provided later, and the answer to that is yes. We will send out an email when they've been processed and are uploaded on the site so you can watch them again. And somebody asked if there's suggestions for reliable nurseries that sell plants. And Xerces right now is working with Spring Creek Prairie Audubon to create a plant list and different nurseries that you can buy pollinator-friendly plants at. So if you stay tuned, that should be coming out in a couple of months. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you on Thursday.